We'll give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Well, welcome everybody to our Salt Lake City.net user group meetup today. It's been a beautiful day here in the Salt Lake area. We're glad that you decided to spend some time with us this evening, and we're really excited for our presenter tonight. We do want to remind you to please stay on mute until you're prepared to speak. That'll greatly reduce the echo and feedback in large online meetings like this. Comments are welcome, however, and if you feel uncomfortable jumping in with a comment, there's a chat option in both Zoom and YouTube. So if you have something to add or a question, you can type it in the chat. One of the hosts will try to bring it up at a good moment. We also appreciate those of you who have your camera on, as being able to see each other enhances our interaction. And at the same time, we ask that you please be aware of whether or not your camera is on and what might be visible in the foreground or background to others. With that said, let's go through our agenda really quick here. We're obviously in the intro. Here in a few minutes, we'll talk about lightning talks, and then we'll have the core of our meeting tonight will be best practices for sustainable repos and pipelines by Andrew Arnott. And then finally, at the end, we'll do some prizes, we'll collect some feedback, and then we'll dismiss the main part of the meeting. And for those who want to stick around, we'll have our book club, and we'll be talking about chapters 4 and 5 of the Phoenix Project. So just a few things of housekeeping. One thing is I'm going to paste a link into the chat right now, and that is our July meeting is going to be basically the week of July 4th. And so for those of you who can see the link in the chat, that's just a little quick questionnaire to respond whether or not you would be interested in attending another virtual meetup. We won't be in person, but attending on July 8th. And we'll share that link at the end of the meeting as well. We also want to remind everybody that we do have a YouTube channel. And so you should take an opportunity to pop over to the YouTube channel at some point and like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That helps us all feel better about our popularity. It also helps people find us with all the fun search algorithms. And then finally, like I said a minute ago, during the meeting, you can ask questions using the chat feature on Zoom or on YouTube. And that brings us to lightning talks. So the guidelines for our lightning talks are simple. As a volunteer to do a lightning talk, you have 5 minutes to talk about anything tech or tech adjacent, really anything that you think would be interesting to our group. If you want to volunteer, you can simply unmute and pipe up. You can say so in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the reactions, and we'll add you. We have time for 2 lightning talks with a 5-minute limit. And while some of you may be thinking about doing lightning talks, I will also let you know that if you're at all like me, you hit this point and think, oh yeah, well, I could talk about the custom ASP.NET MVC formatter I just had to write, or I could talk about the cool electronics kit that I soldered last weekend, but I'm not really prepared. Well, we have an option for you. When we do the speaker feedback at the end of the night, and a little prize entry survey, you can flag your interest in doing a lightning talk. And if you just say yes, or maybe you would be interested in doing a lightning talk, we will send you a reminder a few days before our next meetup, just to prime your thinking and give you an extra day or two to prepare. And with that, I'm sharing my screen, so I can't see the full grid of people. Does anybody have their hand up, or would anybody like to volunteer to do a lightning talk? I don't see anything in the chat yet. Let's see. No hands up still. Any volunteers? Well, those of you who've stuck around for book club know that I have the patience of Job when it comes to sitting in silence and waiting for somebody to pipe up. But for lightning talks, we need to move a little bit quicker. I will. I'll give everybody a last call here. Maybe a countdown in my head of 10 if you'd like to give a lightning talk today. If not, we will move on to our main presenter. Going once.
Surely someone else will give a lightning talk to prevent me to give a lightning talk about lightning talks.
We could discuss Bitcoins if anybody's interested.
Let's do it.
Okay.
All right. Well, Tony, if you want to take up to 5 minutes to start to do a lightning talk about Bitcoin, I will start the timer when you start talking.
All right. Well, my understanding and experience on that is next to zero. And I thought this would be more of a discussion on trying to get people to say what they know about it and what I've heard about it and my laments with it and maybe other people's laments or positive things about it. What interests me about the mining thing is I believe our processor shortages, our electronic shortages are based on people buying too much hardware to mine Bitcoins or Ethereum. And they're offsetting the price for normal consumers to buy this product, our normal computers. Has anybody looked graphic cards or memory or CPUs lately and notice how expensive those are? They're beyond ridiculous. And you could go, for example, the new NVIDIA cards, the 3000 series, the RTX 3000 series, they come out initially average price about $600. You can't buy them. You can't buy them in stores. You have to go and buy them online for about 5 times the price. So I think it's a bad thing to use hardware and people with a lot of resources to just buy out the market and just have machines running Bitcoin that now has some kind of value that's astronomical. Anybody know what's the value of Bitcoin today? Anybody?
Somewhere around 30,000, 32 maybe.
Really?
Last I heard it was like 10,000 for like a single one or something.
I think why don't you try about $64,000 at Bitcoin?
No, you're a few weeks behind.
Am I that behind?
Yeah, the last few weeks have been brutal. It did almost reach 30,000 last week. It's 37,000 today.
Yeah, I've got 36.9 and change today at the moment.
When I was checking, this must have been a month or so back, it was in the $64,000 range. And I didn't think it was going to drop that fast. This is interesting. But
I bought into Bitcoin at $14 a piece back in 2011, and I bought 40 of them.
Oh, yes.
I sold them before, later.
Of course.
I didn't keep them as long as I wish I had now, but it helped me buy a house, so that was nice.
Yeah, well.
But I could have bought a lot of houses for that if I'd
Yeah, you would have been really, you could retire now with your 14 Bitcoins.
Well, I'm old enough to have bought into I'm old enough to have bought into eToys and Pets.com and some of these others in the very first .com bubble. So I'll let you guys play the Bitcoin bubble, and I'll sit this one out.
To me, I wouldn't play it. To me, it's kind of a sketchy thing.
It's interesting because I've talked to people in my circle who are, not tech savvy at all, right? That are like I talked to a mortgage broker, and he's like, you know what I've been doing with some of my money? I've been putting some of it into cryptocurrency. I said, really? But he sees it as a good place to put it as an alternative, just in case, like if the stock market tanks, then maybe the crypto market will stay good, or, housing or whatever. So I don't know. He said he was using it as a hedge, was the word he termed, and I'm not going to get into like stock market jargon or anything like that, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
I don't have any. Well, I do, but it's on a wallet that I lost a long time ago, and only like $200 worth. So
to me, it seems like the economy is changing, and it's going to be different. Whatever's coming out is going to be different, and these are part of the players coming in with new ideas to keep the idea of a monetary system going, and something that you can invest. And who knows what's going to happen, what's going to come out.
Yeah.
Well, we're at 10 seconds. So let's give a bit of reaction applause to Tony. We appreciate the lightning talk, Tony. The topic of Bitcoin. That was very good, very interesting. Does anybody else have a lightning talk they'd like to give, or do we need to listen to Will's lightning talk about lightning talks?
Don't make me do it. I will.
I could always talk about the nature of time.
Does this talk include discussion of tachyons, Tony?
No, that's more of theoretical stuff. I'm talking more metaphysical things.
Okay.
Well, for this month, I'm going to propose we're going to move on. If we have this much reluctance for lightning talks next month, then we'll have Will for sure do his 5-minute lightning talk on lightning talks. But I do know that our presenter is a little bit pressed for time, so we're going to move on. So let me introduce our presenter, Andrew Arnott. He is a principal software engineer at Microsoft. I cyber stalked him a little bit. I know he's been there for almost 12 years, I think. And he mostly works on or around the Visual Studio product. His expertise includes threading, async, RPC, interop, cryptography, repo and pipeline maintenance for several teams. His other interests include cryptocurrency, camping, and hanging out with his wife and 4 kids. He lives in, I believe, Longmont, Colorado. You're in the Denver area, and I do know that he did live in Utah for a while. That he went to a school that is south of the school that I went to, and not necessarily my favorite school, but he is a graduate of Brigham Young University, and we are excited to have him here. And so I am going to. I did want to mention one other thing, and hopefully you'll share your GitHub at the end of the meeting. But I did notice you have a couple of GitHub repositories and projects that are on NuGet that I've encountered in the past, including Iron Pigeon and a validation project that I noticed on your GitHub. So I was kind of excited that this first time we've met virtually today, but I've actually encountered your work in the past. So with that, we're going to turn the time over to Andrew, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, thanks. That was an entertaining introduction. Just sharing my screen here too. Let's see. All right. Yes, all that's correct. With one caveat, I've been at Microsoft 15 years. All of that in DevDiv, 13 of those years working for the Visual Studio Platform team, which has been very rewarding. I've learned a lot. Most of those interests in software engineering has grown in that area. And as part of my work, I do work with a lot of different teams, and one of the areas of expertise that I've picked up has, because it hasn't been my primary focus, but I've kind of become the area expert around repo maintenance and pipelines and best practices, which is why I felt like it was worth sharing this, and I've shared a similar presentation with these teams as well. And I do invite interruptions. I will pause periodically anyway to encourage them again. But if I say something that you don't understand or you disagree with, or you want to tell a different way of doing it, I totally welcome that. And I'm going to start with several slides, because what I'm going to show you is probably going to be somewhat overwhelming, or you'll be like, that's crazy. This guy is way overboard, unless I explain to you some of these principles that I think all of us can get around, most of them at least. So the goals, when we're maintaining repos and our pipelines, we want every repo to be approachable, maintainable, embody and encourage best practices, not just for the repo, but for the code that you're tracking in that repo. And we want to leverage pipelines for all the value that they can give us. Using them to automate your workflows as much as possible, reproducibility of your builds and tests across machines and across time, and absolutely, I mean, if you're just doing this for fun, all of the above still applies. I have plenty of repos, as Gary mentioned, where they're just a hobby that I have. So all of the above still I find rewarding and useful to keep up. The satisfy shipping and servicing requirements would apply, especially if you have a boss that cares about making money and keeping your customers happy. If you care about that too, certainly shipping and servicing requirements can apply. So we're going to go through most of those bullet items one by one, just to talk a little bit about it. And I can't see the chat session when I'm in this mode. So actually, I'm going to try to make an adjustment so I can see if people are texting as well as talking. Got to convince Zoom to stay open. This is the.
So Andrew, is the captioning being created on your side, or is that something on our account? I know some people have asked, at least one person has asked how to turn off the subtitles on.
Oh, you don't like them? Oh, usually I get positive feedback on them being there.
I personally like them. I like them. I deal with a large number of people that are
I like them too.
Are disabled, but it may so if it's something that's being generated by you, then
yes, it is
likely something. I would suggest that you keep them on, and we'll just get used to it.
Yeah. So they'll turn off when I get to showing the demo, but for the slides, PowerPoint is doing this for me. And yeah, Microsoft is big on accessibility, and so am I. So even if you're not hard of hearing or something, a lot of people that I present to mention if they miss something, it is useful to have the text down there. It's usually pretty accurate. I can't find where to show the text, make the text window reappear now that I'm presenting. It's gone. So I'm going to just rely on the co-hosts to call out when there's questions. Okay, so approachable repos are repos that any developer familiar with your SDK, lightly familiar, should be able to just clone your repo and build it on their own machine, and preferably run the tests and open it up in Visual Studio as well. So many repos that I see have new weirdisms that you have to know in order to be able to build it. They don't have scripts for it, or they do, but they're often some weird directory. The README or contribution document is out of date. And basically, you have to talk to somebody on the inside to figure out how in the world do you build this thing. Every single repo should have a common pattern that's very, very simple, so that anybody can build and and run tests. For an OSS repo, it's kind of a prereq for being open source. In the spirit of being open source, you've got to let everybody else easily reproduce it. But even for closed source stuff, this is so useful. At least at Microsoft, people leave and join teams all the time. You want your new developers to be as productive as possible, as quickly as possible. So it's really important that we spend the little bit of time necessary so that the repos will build with a standard, simple convention. Repo, I don't trust any repo that requires elevation, except the one I have to for work, because we have one repo that requires that. But we all hate it, and we all want to fix that. So we're going to. But whenever you can design your repo so that a new clone does not require elevation to install SDKs or whatever, that's goodness. .NET Build and .NET Restore for the .NET folks, and this is a .NET user group, so that's great, because that's my favorite platform and SDK. But sometimes, and .NET Restore will certainly bring down as many dependencies as you can get from NuGet. But if there's another SDK that you might need, maybe the .NET SDK itself, I find that an init script in the root of your repo can be a very common convention that everybody can get around. You clone a repo, you run init, and now you're ready to go. And my init actually runs .NET Restore as well, but the main point of it is a one-time setup of whatever prereqs you need. And then ideally, anybody on any kind of device, whether they're using a Mac, Linux, or Windows, should be able to build your repo. And if the software that you're building should be able to run on those OSs, certainly the tests should be able to run on those devices as well. And if you haven't heard of dev containers or haven't tried them, give them a shot. They are pretty cool. I will demonstrate that later on as well. I'm at the end of a slide, so this would be a great time for someone to jump in with a question if you had one. Okay. Maintainable. So many, I've learned this the hard way. Yes, I've got a long history of GitHub repos. In fact, somebody pointed out, I think it was like the 4,000th user on GitHub. I've got a very, very low user ID. I didn't know they had user IDs until somebody pointed it out. But, gee, Andrew, you've been around a long time. I guess I have. But a lot of my repos that I haven't touched in over a year don't build anymore. But they built then, right? Have you ever had that time, that experience? Where you come back to some code that you know worked when you left it, and then it takes me hours or sometimes days to try to get a repo to build again. That's no good. SDKs change, Visual Studio changes, whatever your tool sets are that you're using to build change, and they should be able to build over time, so you don't have to waste time doing all that, and so you can service. We'll talk more about that later. But certainly, the common maintenance that you need to do, updating versions, should be easy. You shouldn't be repeating yourself if you have scripts or versions. They should be the same scripts and versions that you use locally, that everyone else uses, that the pipeline uses. And a big one is minimize, AppVeyor, Azure Pipelines, GitHub Actions, that most of them have these task ideas or action, in Azure Pipelines, it's tasks, in GitHub Actions, it's an action, and they all want to do magic for you, various useful things. I avoid that whenever possible. I don't bend over backwards because they are useful sometimes for like deployments to cloud and things. They do things that your scripts have a hard time doing, but anything that a script can do, I write with my own script. And the reason for that is because the more that the pipeline does that you can execute locally, the more likely your PR will pass the build test the first time and you're not embarrassed and have to go fix your build after everyone else has already started reviewing your code. And if a cloud build failure occurs and you check out that commit and you build it locally or run the workflow locally, it's going to fail on your machine too. It makes it so much easier to introduce changes to your workflows if those workflows can actually be executed locally. It's not strictly about repos, it's more about code, but TDD is amazing. I have a whole hour presentation that I would give this over and over again to teams at Microsoft. So you get one bullet form of this. If you wanted to get promoted out of your team or to a new position of responsibility, or you want to leave your team someday, or even if you want to go to dinner without worrying about your new hired coworker breaking something and checking it in, write a test for your code. And I personally love to write my test first because that ensures that I actually did it, because it's really easy to check in once that you've fixed whatever you're fixing or adding a feature and not taking time to write the test for it. And it's so worthwhile. Over and over. At Microsoft, there are so many complex libraries that I've written that I have rewritten basically from scratch and been able to check into the product that it contributes to, and without any regressions at all because of TDD. And that rewriting is expensive and things, but if you've got if you've got tests that are basically the spec for what you're building, I can rebuild the same library in four times as fast as the original one, at least, and with a tiny fraction of the risk with tests. So please do test. Absolutely check in an editor config file and a get attributes file to codify what your white space and formatting rules are. I highly recommend a get attributes file with text, auto, star, or whatever, the one that you get by default when you create a repo in VS. There are some religious arguments about whether Git should be normalizing your line endings. I am all for it. Git does mess with your source code when merge conflicts occur anyway, and I'm tired of the big red and green wall of diffs and merge conflicts that come because somebody didn't consistently change the line, or didn't, inconsistently set the line endings. Git attributes can just end that, and you'll never talk about it again. In every repo where Git attributes normalizes your line endings, you never ever hear about a complaint later. And finally, leverage static analyzers. Again, that's more for code cleanliness, but part of your best practices for repos and pipelines is encourage good, healthy coding practices. So that's part of that. All of your workflow, I touched on this a bit on the last slide, but all of your build, pack, test, deployment, shipping, versioning, everything you have to do in turning the crank should all be fully automated. They should be checked into source control so you can service a build from years ago, and that workflow still works. So many Azure pipelines didn't support this initially. So at Microsoft, a lot of our teams still have these web UI based pipelines where from 1.0, we wrote the pipeline and it worked. And then when 1.3 shipped, we had to change the pipeline a bit because the software changed. And now we can't use that same pipeline on 1.0 anymore. That's no good. So checked in workflows or pipelines, whether it's GitHub Actions or Azure pipelines or AppVeyor, whatever it is, check them in so that you can always come back and run whatever process was required by that particular version of your code. Reproducible builds are also very, very important. I touched on, if you pull out a repo from a year ago that nobody's touched since then, odds are pretty good it doesn't build anymore. So these patterns and practices will help ensure that your repos, if they build today, they're going to build 5 years from now. And maybe you don't care, especially if you're developing cloud software that you don't ship to customers, you deploy to the cloud, you don't care about 5-year-old software, that's fine. But if you do ship your software, and you might have servicing requirements, in Visual Studio, we have to service code for software that we ship for 10 years. So this is a really, really big deal for us. So you can decide how much of a big deal it is for you. But even if you don't want it reproducible across time, it's really useful to have it reproducible across machines as well. So that whether you're on your desktop computer or your laptop, or whether it's you or your colleague, it builds the same way on everybody's machine. And so the two tend to go together. If you're super good across machines, you're also going to be super good across time.
Andrew, can I jump in with a question? On your previous slide about doing your build pipelines, you had a comment that said always use YAML pipelines. Don't use the web UI to create them. And so working with some people who on my team who are starting to do some of their own pipelines, I've told them, just for simplicity, they can create the pipeline using the web UI, but then inspect the YAML and do their customization in YAML. Is there a reason why I shouldn't be telling them to do that?
So if the idea is that they are just using the web UI to generate the YAML and then they copy and paste that into a YAML file, no concerns with that. I do that too. If you don't know what the name of the task is, by all means, web UI is a good tutorial, but then I don't save that YAML file. And in fact, nowadays, you can even edit the YAML file within the web UI and see the YAML there. And you can choose tasks with the UI that helps you know what the inputs are and things. That's all fine.
Okay.
The main point is don't rely on, and even if you have a YAML file, you do have to actually go to the web UI to tell it to use the YAML file. That's fine. The main idea is that that web-based YAML or pipeline should be as absolutely bare necessity to point to the YAML file as possible. Like even if you're using a YAML file, you can still tell the pipeline which agent pool to use, whether to clean the repo before it starts building, a whole bunch of different settings around the YAML you could set with the web UI. Don't do it. Set it in the YAML instead.
Okay.
Would be my recommendation. The one exception to that would be secret variables. When your pipeline requires secret variables for deployment or something, by all means, do that in the web UI. Your YAML can consume those secret variables, but don't check in secrets for sure. There's no reason to check in secrets, and plenty. Why not? So good question.
Thanks.
Let's see. Your repo should be largely self-sufficient. It really hurts the approachability of a repo if your repo can't build without another repo next to it in a particular file system configuration. So avoid that. Your dependencies, and you do have them, even if it's just the SDK you use, should be precisely specified. So I hear of people who use stars. It's very popular in NPM and even in NuGet, they support wildcards. Don't use wildcards. Or if you do, at least specify the major and probably the minor version of the package before you use the wildcard. But I never, ever use wildcards. Because again, I want my commit to build 5 years from now and produce the exact same thing it did before. If I want my repo to get a later version, I will update a later version and I'll make a commit to represent that upgrade so that everyone can see this is what had happened and this is why the behavior suddenly changed. Not, well, I did restore today and now the build is broken. I don't know why. That's no good. And finally, to the extent possible, all of your dependencies should be acquired through your init script in the root of the repo. Some dependencies, maybe that's Unity or something, may require you to actually download and install an application that requires elevation. In those cases, by all means, document it in the contribution MD file so that it's at least discoverable. But to the extent that you can put it into init PS1, then it's easier. You're also encoding the URLs to specific versions of the tools that you're installing so that, again, it's reproducible later because maybe you can't get Unity 8.0 5 years from now. But if it's in an init script that knows exactly what the URL used to be, then you're gold. And this applies to the .NET SDK as well, as I'll show you. Again, for cloud services, this might not be so interesting, but if you're shipping software, and by that, pushing to NuGet.org counts as shipping software, I develop a consistent convention for naming branches and tags so that you can service and you know what you're doing and you know where to stabilize. I personally, this is the opinionated section. It's just a suggestion if you don't know where to start, but different people have different models. I like to do my main development in my default branch, like main or master. And then when I'm getting ready to ship a version, such that I'm stabilizing and I'm limiting the kinds of development I do, that's when I branch off and I name the branch after the version, major, minor, that I'm going to ship. And then main development would continue in the default branch, but fixes before I ship would go into v1.2. And then when I actually ship, that's when I tag it. And I tag it with the full version number, which would be 1.2.3 or whatever. And finally, versioning can be really tedious and lead to a lot of bad practices. So I developed NerdBankit versioning, which automates nearly all of this. It's pretty well adopted in a lot of repos inside and outside of Microsoft. It gets a lot of road testing. It's really fast. It's just a package reference and a version JSON file in your repo. And there's even a tool to automate that, even though that's like 3 lines. So it's super, super easy to start using. All right, time for the interactive demo. Oops. Okay, so basically, because all of those patterns and practices we've talked about are inherently good no matter what platform or language you're coding in. But as this is the .NET users group and I do a lot with .NET, I codified them in a template repo. Even before GitHub had template repos, I just used the repo as a template where you can git clone this repo and run the expand template script. I'll make this a little bit bigger. There's an expand template script that I run, and it asks you a couple of interview questions, sort of like npm init, if you've ever used npm init before, where it says, well, what do you want to call this project? That's what this does. And then it'll get you started on a brand new repo that has all the best practices already built in. And this is the conglomeration of years of learning of, oh, that's painful. And so you're going to see a lot of things in this repo where you're like, well, why is that there? And why did he do it this particular way? And my gosh, it's a lot of files for a brand new repo. You know, all of these thoughts are probably going through your head. And it's years and years of road testing, realizing, oh, okay, servicing gets harder unless you do this. And oh, on this particular build or on this particular machine, it didn't work out unless we did this. So we want it to work everywhere. So we're going to do that for everybody. There's a lot of just general maturing of this, and it's very I mean, you can see the last commit was 9 days ago. Every time I learn something, I codify it in this repo, and then I replicate it across all of the other repos. So let's take through. So this is a public GitHub repo. You can use it. There's a link going to be in the slide deck that I'll share at the end that I've been going through, so you can find it again later. But in GitHub, you can even click use this template and give it a name, and away you go. So I'm just going to take some time to go through some of the aspects of it so you understand why in the world there's so much here and how it ties into the slides. Actually, before I go any further, any comments, questions, accusations, disagreements? I talked a lot about a lot of principles. Maybe I'm thinking most people will agree with them. I bet some of them are debatable, though. Or maybe you don't ship code, you deploy it, and I totally missed something, and it's a best practice that you've learned. Please feel free to pipe up and share that too. Once in a while, this comes down. I don't know why this comes down. If people are chatting in the chat window, then I apologize for not seeing it. Wait, there it is. Haha. Okay, so according to this, nobody said anything. Okay.
Been very quiet. I think everyone agrees. That's what it means.
That's great. Hopefully there are a few of you who will benefit from agreeing but not quite knowing how to do it best, so this time will be useful to you. So here's the get attributes file that I mentioned. Star text equals auto is going to end all of your line ending problems, except for the very, very rare conditions where you really do need it checked out with a particular line ending. That's either for tests that do verbatim, expected versus actual tests of files, or in this case, Bash is really particular about LF line endings. So I do have to override it and say that, but even that's normalizing it. So I never ever get issues with line endings in Git merge. And then editor config, this is basically the default that Visual Studio gives you, with a few of my own changes as well, like handling YAML files. README has the, this is the interesting twist on this particular template. The template has its own test system to make sure that the pipeline that it advocates people use actually works. So if you click on this, it actually takes you to a real pipeline that actually builds this template and actually builds a NuGet package and pushes it to a private feed. Not NuGet.org. And it has a GitHub action that also works. So whether you're GitHub Actions buff or an Azure Pipelines buff, we've got you covered either way. But it gets you started with a README. This README file advertises what's cool about this repo. So should yours. So you would obviously change this README file to be what's, advertise your own thing. And then espouse the contributing document too, probably for the contributors, which also explains, in my case, again, how you approach this repo, but primarily it's generic. So if you start your repo with this template, you probably don't even have to change this file up front. You'd only change it when you add extra dependencies or something. So let's see. Style cop, that's an opinionated style, analyzer. But if it's opinionated, the way I see style cop, I agree with 97% of the rules and I hate 3% of them. And you can turn them off and you can customize them. But the point is, if you codify whatever conventions you want in that repo, including by using analyzers that will help enforce it, it just ends the debate. And especially for OSS repos, your contributors know what you expect and they can comply with them, and you lose less time in PR saying, well, fix this, and you've got white space here and you're not putting the curly brace in the right place. So this just helps. Yeah, so here's my init script that I was telling you about. Now, this init script will install the .NET SDK for you if you don't have it. And it defaults to not elevating, because frankly, if people clone my repo and it requires elevation, they shouldn't trust me. So this will actually default to installing the .NET SDK in a per user location. But if you, that makes consuming it from Visual Studio a little harder if you don't have the SDK installed. And so you can install it in the per machine location, which makes consumption from Visual Studio easier. Although you can actually consume it even from the per user location as long as you run the init script first and then launch devenv from there, from that particular window. And then for your Azure pipelines, if you run your build on a shared agent, such that like an agent, if you're not on the hosted agents, if you've got your own team and you have your own build agent that you use repeatedly, it's usually a good idea to not pollute state on that shared machine. And so even the per user location is actually putting stuff in files in locations that other repos, other pipelines will be able to see. And so it also has a per repo location where it can install the SDK. So I could do this right now. I could say init ps1 install locality repo. And this will actually download the .NET SDK that I need for this repo and install it under, under this repo directory. So it's my very own SDK, very exact version that I need, and it doesn't mess with anything, any of my machine state or user state, which is great. If you do have an Azure pipeline, if you're using Azure DevOps and you're pushing to private feeds, Azure Artifact feeds for NuGet packages and things, you need to be able to do a package restore that requires authentication. This script works for you too. .NET Restore doesn't actually work, does not restore packages from private Azure Artifact feeds unless you have the credential helper installed. This script will take care of that as well, so that really, you know, even for closed source repos or private feeds, if your new hire clones the repo and runs init, they're going to get all the packages. They're not going to have authentication issues. And you have to tell them about how to install these extra tools to make NuGet work. So again, that's one of those, your first repo is not going to have this, but over time you figure out, oh, I need this. So there we go. I've got my SDK installed. It's probably under, yeah, here it is. So here's the .NET SDK that's installed just in this one repo location. So part of that is global JSON. Now this is somewhat controversial, both inside and outside of Microsoft, but it's part of pinning your dependencies so that you can come back to this repo later, and so that you get to schedule your downtime. Because what happens if you don't have a global JSON file and if you don't set the roll forward property to something very, very precise, what happens is the .NET SDK team will ship a new version and all of your builds will be on the floor. Your Azure pipelines or GitHub actions will suddenly break, and half of the devs that are working in this repo will report, hey, it doesn't work on my machine either, but the other half it will, because they have, some of them have updated their SDK and some of them haven't. And it's just a mess. And the worst part is you didn't schedule the mess. It just happened the day before you shipped, and crap, now you're in panic mode. So I'm a huge advocate for pinning all your dependencies, including the .NET SDK, because it's burned me so many times. So in this case, I know that this repo builds successfully and tests successfully, and I can ship it if it builds with the .NET SDK of this version. And I want this exact version. Now, patch will allow a 203 to be used instead of 202. I have even been broken by patch updates, just so you know. But here I'm recording in the official build, it will use this version. So I know this one works. And 203 will probably work as well. And then periodically, I'll just come in and see what the latest version is. I'll just go to, let's see, over here, get.net. I'll check out the latest. I'll go to all .NET downloads, .NET 5. See, okay, oh, look at that. 5.0301 is the latest version. I definitely want to be on the latest version, so I paste that in. I commit it. I create a PR, and the pipeline will succeed or fail, and I won't complete the PR if it fails. So I get to set the time. Like if this had a breaking change in it such that my pipeline was going to break, it broke on my PR. That's a much, much better place for it to break than on everybody's machines on the CI build, right? Where it will get in the way of your shipping the next day. The reason I say this is controversial, the biggest reason is by setting this, the average Joe that clones your repo and just tries to do .NET build will very likely get an error saying you don't have the right SDK installed. Because unless they have at least 50202, they could only differ by being higher in the patch version, it's gonna say you don't have the right SDK installed, so they actually have to run init and install the SDK. So it makes the approachability of the repo slightly harder, but what you lose in approachability, you can minimize with the init script, and you win back in maintainability. Over time, this commit will keep building as a result of this, which is, in my experience, been super valuable. May I have the URL to the GitHub template? Yes. I see the chat window there. So,
I think I just,
thank you, Gary. Yep,
got it. Yep.
You did. Thank you, Gary. Okay.
Do you have or make assumptions about prior builds? In other words, do you always run through and run that init PS script, regardless of whether it may still exist on the build machine or anything like that?
I make no assumption. I wouldn't have covered this otherwise, so I'm glad you asked. I make no assumptions about the build machine. In fact, I would prefer a build machine that didn't have any SDKs, because if it has SDKs already on it, then I could have a dependency on it without knowing it. And so in fact, if you look at my template or my pipeline here, I want to point out something. I don't know where it is. I think it's probably down here. Yeah, okay, here. So for example, this is an environment variable that changes where the NuGet package cache is found. So I've seen a lot of build breaks where your CI was fine, and then suddenly your CI broke. Why? Because you had some MS Build project that reached directly into the package cache and looked for a particular NuGet package in a particular version to get a file out of it, but it wasn't using package reference or packages config to ensure that it would actually be there. And yet, for the local developer box, it worked. For the CI and PR, it worked because the machine happened to have the package there already. By setting this environment variable, I'm telling NuGet, do not restore packages to the normal place. Install them to a place that is guaranteed to be clean at the start of my pipeline execution, so that if anybody makes any assumptions about where the packages are, or that a package has been restored, but they didn't say that they needed it restored, it will fail. You don't want non-deterministic failures. You want deterministic failures, and this guarantees it will fail. Now, your question was about SDKs, was it? Could you repeat your question, Caleb?
Well, that was just an example. It was if, for example, the SDK wasn't downloaded, then you would have to run the init PS1 script in order for that particular one to succeed.
Okay, right.
But if it had already been present, then obviously performance would be better. It wouldn't need to necessarily be present on the system.
Yep. So this is another one of those trade-offs. You can see in this particular repo, which has very, very little code in it, I can actually build it in 8 seconds, but I spend a minute running init. Like, oh my gosh, you're quadrupling the time of your pipeline. How can init be a good idea? Again, it's these. First of all, a minute's not going to make or break anything in your life or for your business. And most of your builds will actually take longer than 8 seconds because you actually have a reasonable amount of code in it. But it's the value you get for this as far as reproducibility. But to your point, couldn't you skip this if it was already there? Yes. And in fact, a previous version of the template did skip installation if the agent already had it installed. And interestingly enough, it well, it's just a lot faster on Linux. I'm not entirely sure why it's a lot faster on Linux, because we do the install on Linux as well. The issue with taking dependencies on existing SDKs is I don't trust whatever agent it is. Like eventually there's going to be some security fix, or the agent VM image is just going to be so large that Microsoft or GitHub or somebody will finally make a decision, hey, let's rip some of these SDKs out. We don't need all these SDKs installed. In fact, they had a policy a year or two ago where Azure Pipelines agents only ship the latest SDK, which regularly broke us. So I actually talked them into adopting the same app Bayer policy, which was, no, you only add SDKs, you never remove them. And they've honored it. I just don't trust them to continue honoring it perpetually. I think later, eventually they're going to be convinced to remove some of them. And so I always install them. And the last thing is, well, why don't you skip it if it's already there? Because if I skip it if it's already there, I could have a dependency. Like if I allow using an SDK that was already on the machine, again, it's possible that somebody introduces a dependency on that version in my repo that is not documented. And so I actually have code in here. I got to find it. Build. So install dependencies. I think it's just init. I think it's just init that does this. So one of the things that init will do, maybe not directly, might be in here. Install.SDK. Maybe set in. When we install the SDK, we also set an environment variable. Here it is. Here it is. I forbid the .NET SDK to look for other SDKs installed on the machine. I say, you're going to use just the one that I tell you to use, which is this one, the one that I just installed. And so, again, it's about reproducibility across time. If this agent had the SDK and I just made assumption, and if it has 15 SDKs and I accidentally depended on a particular version of it, but I didn't document it, I'd get away with it. But because I set this environment variable, I can't get away with it, which forces me to actually specify the version of the SDK that I depend on, which means that this commit will last for years and years. So again, I try really hard to not depend on any environmental state on that. And I better hurry because I've got just a few minutes left. So I've got some tools here, some PowerShell scripts that I rarely run. These are just helpers to the init script, basically, but they can run independently if you really wanted them to. They just go into the don't repeat yourself principle. The init script doesn't hard code which SDK to install. It actually reads the global JSON file to figure that out. Also, your tests might very rightly run on multiple run types. They might run on .NET Framework, they might run on Mono, they might run on multiple versions of .NET Core. So another thing that these scripts will do, in addition to installing the SDK that you need, is they'll actually crawl your repo to find out which runtimes are also required. So if you look closely at this init log, you'll see it's not just installing the SDK, it's installing 3 .NET Core runtimes. Again, ensuring that even after that runtime is no longer installed on the agent or on a user's machine, you'll be able to build and test this later. Directory build props and targets. I mentioned we use Git versioning. So there's the version. We're building 0.1 beta right now. And I've got some directory build props. So I set the target framework to net standard 2.0, which is a reasonable default for your libraries, but you can change that. All of this. One of the reasons why I don't actually go to links to try to make this more shareable, where you can actually link these files directly in from another repo, is because most repos will need to fix certain things up, saying, well, that particular policy doesn't work for me. So you can pick and choose what you want. My policy, my convention is, I'll basically robocopy this repo into the repo that I'm working in, and then just do look at the diff and see which ones make sense and which ones I should throw back out. The director, setting your company and authors, setting PDB policies so that your PDBs are included in a NuGet package or not. Like there's just use C#9, always use the latest C# language. That's great. Latest, as in don't use the term latest, because again, that's not pinning your dependencies, right? I actually specify it, but I always update this to use the latest. I changed the output paths to get a read-only source tree. You'll notice I have bin and obj at the top level of my repo. If I expanded this, it's just source code. I can look though, and each of my projects produce a bin and obj folder out here, so that just makes it easier to reason about things. I prefer this, but you could delete that if you want. Azure Artifacts, or Azure Pipelines has publish artifact tasks, but which can do all sorts of interesting things like globbing, where it says, okay, well, I'm going to take your whole bin directory, or I'm going to take the DLLs from it, or the packages from it, whatever. But again, in the spirit of so many of the pipeline failures are around, well, you have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing to your PR to try to figure out how to get that dang publish artifacts task to work, right? I never have to worry about that, because all of my artifacts are captured here by these scripts. Each of these PS1 scripts is a trivial selector. All they do is return the paths to files that I want to collect as an artifact. And the artifact is named after the file. So if you want a new artifact, if I wanted to collect all the PDBs, I could just say pdbs.ps1, and I could say, get child items, recursive PDB, and that's it. The biggest thing, it's not that part of it is so easy, it's that I can test this locally. I can run artifacts all, and it will run all of these scripts and dump all the artifacts to my obj directory under artifacts, and I can see, yeah, that's what I had in mind. And then I can check it in, and I know that the Azure pipeline is going to run. So yeah, some of these PS1 scripts that you see are going to be like, well, why did he do this? Because Azure Pipelines and GitHub Actions have tasks that make this, that automate this. And it's so you can test it locally. And so that it'll work long after that Azure Pipelines task is gone or has changed its behavior. Another one is variables. By defining variables, you can define variables, and I do define variables in this YAML file. So here's a bunch of variables. But when I want variables to be customizable through environment variables or something, like there's a neat system in here where you can just name your environment variable and then return the value, or sorry, your pipeline variable, name it here, and then return the value for it, which allows you to then consume that variable easily in your YAML files. And in fact, part of this isn't just about build, this is about deployment. I've got a release YAML file here that consumes the artifact of the build pipeline. So really, if you were going to install this, what you do is you create a pipeline for this file, which is the default name, and then you create another release pipeline here. You had pointed to this file. So you can build, you can do your PR and CIs based on this file. And then when it's time to release something, you run your release pipeline, which consumes a designated run of your build pipeline. So it doesn't rebuild and introduce risk that, well, maybe that build was different than the last build. You can designate an existing build that you've already manually tested if you needed to, and it'll ship that straight off to GitHub or NuGet or whatever it is you wanted to release to. Maybe it's your Azure cloud. Questions? Get proc dump. Like this is one of those, again, road testing things. Your first repo is not going to have this, but eventually you're going to have a test that hangs in Azure pipelines, and it doesn't hang locally. And you pull your hair out like, why? If I could only get a dump of the hung process, I could figure out what in my software has hung. Well, we've solved that for you here. The test infrastructure sets up so that if your test hangs, it will automatically collect a dump and push it as a pipeline artifact. So if your test fails with a hang, you don't need a repro. You can just go to your Azure pipeline and download the dump file, and you've got everything you need. It does run tests on Windows, Mac, and Linux, although lately I've learned that Mac build queues in Azure pipelines tends to be rather long. And so I actually have it turned off by default when you queue a build over here. I can say, let's go library template. Oh, I'm not signed in. That's problematic. Smile for the camera. Oh, the camera doesn't work because I'm using it. right, let's try this again. So when I queue a build, some of the things that I've specified in the YAML files, I can choose, do I want to build on Mac OS or not? And it just turns out I've never seen a bug in my pipeline or the test runs or anything that only repros on Mac. So as long as I'm running on Windows and Linux, I'm covered. But if I felt like I wanted to test on Mac in particular, I could check that box. And if your code really needed to be tested on Mac, you could just have that box checked by default. And by the way, GitHub Actions is probably where everything's going. But for the time being, Azure Pipeline supports more things than GitHub Actions does. Last I checked, GitHub Actions does not let you queue a workflow that lets you pick another workflow's artifacts to consume. And it certainly is nice to be able to go to an existing build and say, you know what, I want to ship this. And again, this is all built into the repo and the pipeline for it. I can just say auto release. And if I hit save right here, that would trigger my release pipeline immediately, and it would ship this particular build out to NuGet and GitHub. And you can do that while it's building if you know you're going to ship that version, or you can go back and tag any past version that way. And that's all because of release. You notice here's the trigger if you auto release something. So there's a lot here. It's huge. Feel free to post issues on it if you have objections or suggestions or questions. I hope you find this useful. Any questions?
I am not sure that I've ever seen a presentation that made me feel like I was such a Neanderthal when it came to all the Azure build stuff. I felt like in my organization I was pretty well skilled at making these things work and pretty much work all the time. But holy cow, there is so much in here that I have not been concerned about at all. So thank you very much for this presentation.
You're welcome. Oh, I did forget to show off the expand template script. And this takes switches, so it doesn't have to be interactive, but you can say library name, calculator, author, Andrew. And then basically in this template, there's a whole bunch of placeholders where those things tend to appear. And it also, strong name sign your assemblies, almost always a really, really good idea. The template comes with a strong name file, but the expand template script actually gives you your own. So this is a brand new one. And then all of those placeholders where you saw company name, basically this gets you at a good start, and it renamed everything to calc. Let's see, there's a question. I guess it's just privately to me, though, so I won't read it out loud just in case. So I guess Gary also mentioned, yes, I do have a couple of other repos. I've got validation, which is just a common validation library for input args primarily, but also can validate internal state. And then Iron Pigeon is a pet project of mine that is sort of like Signal or Keybase, where it's end-to-end encryption, but its unique thing is that it hides the social circles. So if you're concerned that one day something that you're doing now will one day be illegal, it used to be illegal to speak or know Germans, in the US, right? In the 1920s, 1940s, I can't remember. But there were German camps where Germans had to go. They were citizens, they didn't commit any crime, but suddenly it became illegal, and they went to those prison camps because their loyalty was in question. I'm a big privacy advocate. I could do a lightning talk on this next time if I was here. And so even end-to-end encryption is not enough. If you were known to associate with people, then you're exposing yourself to risk of anything that person might be doing that might be illegal today and illegal tomorrow. So Iron Pigeon is this communication protocol that allows you to chat with people in a way that nobody, even the server that might be serving you, it's a distributed system, and nobody, even the server, is trusted to keep your information private because your client is making sure it's all private. So I've got a bunch of repos. You're welcome to look through them, and hope some of them are useful to you. I'm going to shut up now and turn the time back over to the hosts. I'm also going to leave early, just so you know. I've got another appointment I've got to run to. But it's been a pleasure sharing with you. Gary, you're muted.
Muted. There we go. I was probably.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great. I will make sure. So you pasted the link to the slides in the chat. I will make sure that that gets added to the meetup comments as well. And then if you just want to, if there's other ways that you want people to be able to contact you with questions or anything, you and I conversed on email. If you'll just send me an email with that information, I'll make sure that that gets into the meetup as well. Any social links or anything like that you want. But does anybody have a quick last question for Andrew before he steps off? Well, I don't see anything in the chat. I think, Will, you're watching the YouTube. Do you see anything in the YouTube? Nope. Okay. Well, Andrew, thank you very much. We really appreciate you being here. This was a great presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. I am going to go ahead and share my screen again. Figure out which one of these I want to share. There we go. So this is the time we want to make sure that we collect feedback for our presenter. I will let's see, get over here where I can see this. I got too many things going on my screen now. So before we talk much about our sponsors and prizes, please make sure that you go to this link and fill out that I've just pasted in the chat, the tiny URL SLC prize, and fill out your presenter ratings and your comments. And also don't forget on that one, the bit about identifying whether you'd consider doing a lightning talk in the future. And then for job opportunities, for any discussion, for fun, we do have a Slack channel. And our website is slcnet.tech. You can find the Slack invite as well as a link on that site to do presentation proposals. And we're always looking for new and interesting presentations. So if you've decided that 5 minutes for a lightning talk is just too little time for you, we would certainly welcome a presentation proposal. And then also, if you didn't fill it out earlier, let me grab this. This is the link to our questionnaire about the July meeting. So as for anybody who joined a little bit late, our normal scheduled time would be July 8th. That's the week of July 4th. So we just want to collect a little bit of feedback about whether people would be available and interested in meeting in the month of July. So with that said, those links are in the chat for the prize and feedback, and for the July meeting entry. So I'm going to go to the next slide. We want to thank our sponsors. Now, obviously, these groups would have been giving us pizza or sandwiches or something when we're meeting in person, and we really do appreciate. We appreciated that in the past. They're also contributing to hosting the meetings and to some of them are giving the prizes that we give out. And so if you get a chance to support and thank the sponsors, that is always appreciated. I will say that once I go to the next, as I'm on this slide, there is a new sponsor down in the bottom corner. Manning has sponsored us and has given everyone in the group a 35% discount. So I'm going to paste this in the chat. This is the link to the Manning site, and I'm going to Ask Will. Will, you've got your hand raised. What can I do for you?
I do. I just want to say goodbye to our YouTube viewers because I'm going to turn off the stream.